Okay, in many ways I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in with the previous two presentations because my angle is fairly distinctly different, but I think at the same time complementary to what we've just been hearing. And I'd like to kind of clarify kind of my point of departure here. Basically what I'm doing is engaging in rhetorical cultural criticism, for lack of a better term. And what I'm taking a look at is a critical interpretive approach to the textures of texts. And specifically what I'm looking at is the patterns in the structure and language of discussions about nanotechnology. Some of this spins off of a recent book chapter which you can access through my website once this presentation is posted. But what I take a look at is textual data, and the backstory to this is some of my earlier work is taking a look at the Nazi appropriation of science to support their anti-Semitic agenda. And the linkage to this kind of project, it seems that this is far distant from the sort of things we're talking about, but it really isn't, because what I've been doing for quite some time now is using that Nazi appropriation of science example as basically a template for rhetorically crafting risk perceptions. Because here we have clearly an artificially engineered perception of risk, in this case from a particular population. And this is largely being done through rhetorical means long before the outcry of World War II and the imperatives of national survival in a military sense. So what we're taking a look at is the rhetorical crafting of the discursive environment, of the cognitive environment, and of public policy. Also, this whole move from Nazis to nano takes a look at the ways that relationships between science, public policy, and audiences are being crafted. And what I'm doing is a kind of analysis that is rather different from what you've been hearing actually the rest of the conference, because what I'm actually examining is some of these conversations in action. Some of this actually comes from a specific conversation that I'll end with that reflects some of the issues that we have to contend with if we're going to take seriously the role that linguistic choices can play in discussions of risk and formations of risk perceptions. Well, what are we talking about the project being? Well, David Berube actually called for a roadmap to help us compose a risk dialogue with laypersons in nanotechnology. The way that I respond to that kind of call, which I think is a very legitimate and necessary kind of project, is to ask questions about what conditions could generate meaningful discursive engagements. Now, I'm approaching this on a little different level than Pat was. He has a similar kind of agenda, but while he is looking at sort of issues of minimizing interference with the natural environment of deliberative procedures and trying to understand what those are better, what I take a look at is actually the process of give and take in some of these encounters. Now, in my previous work, in the book chapter I referred to a minute ago, what I do is I track how that happens in the discussions of the killer nanobots, okay, and the gray goo scenario, well, the various colors of goo scenarios. And one of the things I want to point out is, although yesterday Dietrich mentioned some of his research that corresponds with a lot of other research, it says this isn't having a lot of quantitative impact in terms of influencing public mindsets about nano. So even though that it's widely talked about, it probably isn't contaminating people's perceptions about nanotechnology. But there's something else that's going on here as well, and that is, despite the fact that it doesn't seem to have a significant quantifiable impact on attitudes about nanotechnology, it is amazingly persistent as a narrative thread, to the point where if you take a look at the popular treatments of nanotechnology. And some of the ones that I've examined are, just the books you pick up off the shelf at Borders or something like that, Nanotechnology for Dummies and things like that. You will find almost as an obligatory part of the discussions of nanotechnology, okay, let's go ahead and refute the killer nanobot scenarios. And the interesting thing about it is one of the arguments that I make here is perhaps the ways that we choose to try to refute what don't seem to be very valid conceptions about nanotechnology may backfire in odd sorts of ways by, strangely enough, perpetuating the course of that narrative thread and extending it further than it otherwise would extend. I'm not saying ignore them, but I'm saying I think we have a wider array of ways to engage some of these problematic sorts of reasonings than the modes that we're doing so, in which we're doing so. Now, what I'm exploring is nano-narratives. Specifically, what we're taking a look at is cases of that kind of elusive animal intuitive toxicology in action. What does this involve? I think on the one hand, we might try to do some sort of a catalog of heuristics regarding reasoning about nanotechnology. But even though I've got a few comments about heuristics in here, I've started reconsidering whether that's really a wise way to think about public reasoning about nanotoxicology. And the reason I'm concerned about that is when we talk about heuristics, we're talking basically about shortcuts and about leaps, almost inferential leaps in some points. But at the same time, what I'm finding is we have extensions of rationales. Specifically, we find an emplotment of small bits of information into story form. And so what we find is that these bits of information that people are gleaning, often in a rather haphazard, strange sort of fashion that's rather hard to capture, are being collected into narratives that pan out in various ways. And we aren't paying a whole lot of attention to what makes up these stories about nanotechnology. And it's that embodiment in a narrative that particularly interests me. And Malcolm Gladwell might say, I'm trying to look at something like what makes for the stickiness of some stories, right? What makes some stickier than others? The way that I examine narratives is by taking a look at several sorts of factors. First of all, the internal narrative texture. What we're dealing with here are the relationships among the different components of the narrative. Okay? And here what we find very often is that the framing that emerges within particular narratives is a function of the relationships among the various characters, and you'll see some specific examples of this momentarily. But the relationships among the different characters and the role that the narrators play in how they tell the story and the relationship of the narrator to the persona of the stories, these sorts of alignments constitute a framing in the sense that we see components of the story in relationship to each other. So it's this kind of internal framing. What we're talking about in a broader sense are a couple of different kinds of relationships that correspond with traditional linguistic theory going all the way back to Saussure, and that is the synchronic intertextual relationships, the relationships of one narrative to another. Very often you'll find this treated in some of the literature on narrative theory about competing narratives. All right, so that you'll have things such as, well, very often what you find is this embodied in political discourse. Okay, and right now I think is a wonderful time for us to think about that, because here we have almost perfectly synchronically, we have the narrative of the sort of mixed heritage, working your way up, and all of that version of the American dream, the story Barack Obama told, and you're going to hear a different kind of narrative emerging, of course, that McCain is going to tell in his address that'll be coming up soon. So we've got those sorts of things, but we also have subsumptive narratives that receive less attention. And here I'm talking about a logic that's much more along the lines of what Kenneth Burke really liked to take a look at, and that is the relationship not of competition, but of container and thing contained. And I think a lot of times what starts to happen in discussions of nanotechnology